Why do I write poetry? I use words as others use algebraic signs, with meticulousness, with caution, with the precision of the artisan. I sculpt in words. I stop. I tilt my head. I listen to the echoes. The tables of emotional resonance. The fine-tuned reverberations of pain and love and fear. Airwaves and photonic ricochets were answered by chemicals secreted in my listeners and my readers. I know beauty. I have always known it in the biblical sense, it was my passionate mistress. We made love. We procreated the cold children of my texts. I measured its aesthetics admiringly. But this is the mathematics of grammar. It was merely the undulating geometry of syntax. Devoid of all emotions, I watch your reactions with the stated amusement of a Roman nobleman. I wrote, "My world is painted in shadows of fear and sadness. Perhaps they are related, I fear the sadness. To avoid the overweening, sepia melancholy that lurks in the dark corners of my being, I deny my own emotions. I do so thoroughly, with the single-mindedness of a survivor. I persevere through dehumanization. I automate my processes. Gradually, parts of my flesh turn into metal and I stand there, exposed to shearing winds, as grandiose as my disorder. I write poetry not because I need to. I write poetry to gain attention, to secure adulation, to fasten onto the reflection in the eyes of others that passes for my ego. My words are fireworks, formulas of resonance, the periodic table of healing and abuse. These are dark poems. A wasted landscape of pain ossified, of scarred remnants of emotions. There is no horror in abuse. The terror is in the endurance, in the dreamlike detachment from one's own existence that follows. People around me feel my surrealism. They back away, alienated, discomfited by the limpid placenta of my virtual reality. Now I am left alone and I write umbilical poems as others would converse. Before and after prison, I have written reference books and essays. My first book of short fiction was critically acclaimed and commercially successful. I tried my hand at poetry before, in Hebrew, but failed. This is strange. They say that poetry is the daughter of emotion. Not in my case. I never felt except in prison, and yet there, I wrote in prose. The poetry I authored as one does math. It was the syllabic music that attracted me, the power to compose with words. I wasn't looking to express any profound truth or to convey a thing about myself. I wanted to recreate the magic of the broken metric. I still recite aloud a poem until it sounds right. I write upright, the legacy of prison. I stand and type on a laptop perched atop a cardboard box. It is ascetic and, to me, so is poetry. A purity. An abstraction. A string of symbols open to exegesis. It is the most sublime intellectual pursuit in a world that has narrowed down and has become only my intellect. How to write poetry. If you want to know how to write poetry, the first thing you have to do is write some. It doesn't matter how it turns out. Your own mistakes will become your teachers. Your own writing will motivate you to greater creativity. Now, once you start the process, how do you improve it? Here are 3 tips. 1. Use nouns and verbs more than adjectives. Which is stronger, she was as beautiful as a flower, or, roses wilted in shame as she passed by. He looked at the depressing clouds, or, he watched as dark clouds moved in, covering his sky. 2. Don't tell the reader how to feel. Let the words elicit the emotions directly, without explaining. The tragedy touched them all, is more touching to the reader as, men and women, doctor and workman, 13 people looked upon the scene, with tears in their eyes. 3. Use dramatic and emotional words. Not all words are equal in their ability to grab a reader or elicit emotion. Fell, take, and love will probably be weaker than plunged, seized, and worship. Look at the following lines, written in 2 ways. The second way applies the 3 rules above. From the poem, Gratitude. 1. The mountains and lakes were beautiful. I looked at them, heard them and smelled them, and I felt an awe too. Mountains stand against the sky, my little lake at their feet, and in the middle of this creation which I see with my eyes, hear with my ears, smell and taste. Words fail, as they should. I hope you agree that the second version is better. Again, if you want to know how to write poetry, you have to start writing. Use these and other rules to help you, but remember that all rules in poetry need to be broken at times. Read your poems aloud to yourself and others as a final test. How to learn the art of creative writing. The term creative writing is used to discern certain types of inventive or artistic writing from other general types of writing. The field of creative writing is broad and includes many different formats and genres of writing. The broad and general description of it is purposeful in its effort not to limit the imagination of the potential writer or that of the reader. Creative writing is totally different from other types of writing, such as technical writing, scientific writing, or copy-driven journalism. The discipline of creative writing includes, but should not be limited to, works of fiction, poetry, personal memoir or autobiography, song lyrics, plays and screenplays, and any mixture of the above. By and large, writing is a skill that is innate to a person. Just like with other proficiencies, most types of writing often comes easier to some people than to others. Therefore, it is often thought that a person cannot be taught how to write, especially creatively. Despite whatever natural talents for writing a person might have, those talents often need to be developed in order for the writer to realize his or her fullest potential in the craft. Learning how to write creatively must begin on the inside. A certain amount of individual experience, opinion, and innate sensitivity must be tapped when taking on the task of creative writing. Creative writing is an artistic expression, like painting or composing music. It is therefore subject to criticism, both constructive and disrespectful. This should in no way deter a person from writing creatively, or in any other way. Sometimes, artistic expression is done just for the sake of doing it. There does not have to be a reason to create something, and there does not have to be an explanation behind the creation. Personal expression is free. This sentiment holds especially true with creative writing. Creative writing courses are extremely popular and widely available in various formats. Short-term workshops ranging from merely a few hours to a day or several weekly sessions are available through public libraries, community education centers, and even community colleges. They are for everyone from the beginner to the seasoned writer looking to polish his or her skills. In a creative writing course, there are many potential topics to discuss and methods to teach at length. These topics include, but are not limited to, techniques on brainstorming and exploring creative ideas, overcoming writer's block, learning how to structure work, overcoming the fear of people reading, judging the created work, editing completed work, and getting works published. Though some will argue that true creative writing cannot be taught, it is widely acknowledged that certain skills can be mined and honed, as well as certain techniques taught, to make almost anyone at least a fair writer, and not be afraid to unleash his or her creativity. Many budding writers opt to study creative writing in college. Often it can be an emphasis within a major in English, and a 4-year bachelor's degree can be earned. This can open doors to many professional opportunities, as well as equip a writer with the skills to either take a stab at freelance writing, or translate his or her creative writing skills into other professional arenas, such as public relations, advertising, or editing. For those whose writing ambition is to do creative writing as more of a hobby, looking to the internet for creative writing websites is a good way to get work seen and gain insight into the craft. Many creative writing websites offer bulletin boards where writers can post works to be read and enjoyed, and where feedback can be given reciprocally. Also, writers can find a real community of individuals looking for other writers with whom to trade and share ideas. Some creative writing websites also offer some of the same lessons and pointers on brainstorming and formulating ideas, editing, publishing, and other techniques that many workshops or writing courses offer, except it often does not cost anything online, and it is more convenient. There is also the appeal of relative anonymity online, for the shy writer who is not quite ready for the face-to-face public arena. True creative writing might not be a learned talent, but the ability to tap inner creativity is possible for just about anyone. My adventure with creative writing. During my last semester of college, I had a few hours that I got to fill with elective classes. I had heard good things about the professor who taught creative writing, and so I signed up for the class without too much thought about the content of the class or what it would require of me. Little did I know when I signed up that the creative writing class would be one of the hardest of my entire college experience. I entered the class on the first day of the semester and was surrounded by what appeared to be all English and art double majors. I tried to shake the fact that I was surrounded by people who write excessive amounts of poetry and gripping short stories for fun, but I just couldn't do it. In my mind, all I could think about was the inevitable failures that were to come as I glanced at the syllabus of assignments for the months ahead. I even calculated my credits for graduation in the evening after that first class to see if there was any way that I could graduate without taking the creative writing class. Because I needed the credits, and quite honestly because I was intrigued by my classmates, I entered the classroom on the second day of class and on each day that creative writing met for the entire semester. It proved to be the most challenging classroom of my education. Each time I entered, it was with a mixture of fear and excitement. I felt fear because I knew that each day things were required of me in creative writing that I had never experienced before, yet I was excited because I had so rarely been challenged to think, really think, before. The first half of the semester creative writing was focused entirely on poetry. I spent many late nights and many tear-filled afternoons working on writing poems. It didn't come easily for me as it did for all of my classmates. Poetry was what naturally came from their mouths every time they talked. I was certainly not used to making my words sound beautiful or intentional. The goal of our poetry section in creative writing was to come up with 10 polished poems that each met different requirements. After the torture of poetry, we moved on to writing short stories and scripts. This half of the creative writing class proved no less challenging for me. I struggled every day until the last assignment had been turned in. In the end, creative writing was not only the most difficult class one had ever taken, but it was also my favorite. The gift of writer's block. Anyone who writes knows this scenario at one time or another. You have something to say, great ideas to express. So, you go to the page only to find your mind has gone as blank as the sheet or screen before you. Paralyzed, you write not a word. Somewhere in the synapses of your imagination, you know there lives a fully formed novel, or story, or play, or even one single poem, but you cannot magnify it enough to see the individual words. So you leave it for another day until your vision is clearer, until inspiration strikes and reveals all 350 pages of text, all 36 lines of poetry. Until the writer's block is gone. Sometimes inspiration does strike from out of the blue, and words pour down like rain. Ideas synthesize, fingers fly, and voila! You've created a masterpiece or at least a pretty good piece of work. But such strikes of inspiration are not, for most of us, the norm. Writing takes commitment, and good writing takes practice. Still, what about writer's block? Even when you're diligent with your practice, even when you show up day after day, you're not immune from the block, from finding yourself without two words that make any sense. What then? First, shift your perspective on what writer's block is. It's easy to panic, to believe it means you'll never write again, that you have no real talent or that you have nothing worthwhile to say. But none of these is near the truth. Writer's block is not the lack of skill or worthiness as a writer, it is, instead, a signifier revealing one of two things. There is a truth you are not yet ready to tell. There is something more that needs to be learned or experienced before the ideas can be fully crystallized. When you write, you cannot help but come up against and touch upon your own inner sore spots and the edges of your comfort zones. To write deeply, you must delve inside and push against these, stretching, questioning, and seeing more and more clearly. The truths you tell yourself are the markers that guide you through. When you come to a place you are not yet ready to go, to words you are not yet ready to say or do something that is not yet in focus, you get stuck. Willingness to face the wall, to approach it with patience, compassion, trust, and honesty, is the way through it. There is no way around it. Your blocks are gifts that push you to grow, to break through the hard places to reach the fertile ground. Let me share an example to explain. When I was writing my novel, I found myself going in circles around a primary relationship in the storyline between the main character and her mentor-teacher. I would talk about the teacher, but I couldn't dive into the center of her role in the novel. Most specifically, I couldn't find any words to put in her mouth. As long as she didn't speak, I was okay. But that was a problem. There came a point when I could no longer keep her mute. She had to speak. But every time I tried, I ended up sitting in front of the screen, hands poised and my insides twisting in frustration. Finally, I decided to get up and move. I went for a walk, and as my limbs fell into a rhythm, my mind fell into the story. The dialogue played out in my head. Away from the computer, I could have a conversation with the characters. I could get inside them and hear what they wanted to say. On that walk, it occurred to me that I had been unable to claim the voice of the mentor before then because I had not been able to claim her within my own being. Whenever the story demanded she speak, I would feel the panic of putting on paper what was being shared as wisdom. Who was I to say such things? Who was I to be the voice of wisdom? But just realizing what was blocking me, what I needed to learn, freed me. And along the way, I opened doorways to my own growth. When feeling blocked, take a walk. Let your body move and your mind ease and flow. Ask yourself what you might fear in the work you are doing, what truth you are not yet ready to claim or tell. And know that we cannot always control the readiness of things. Time teaches us and directs our understanding, and our understanding directs the depth and breadth of our writing. Be patient with yourself. And keep writing. Poems. Web poems help to express feelings that cannot be explained in simple words. Many people love to express their feelings in poems because it has deep thoughts and it leaves a good impression on others. If you are in deep love with poems, you can easily get a good and impressive collection of love poetry, as well as some famous quotes, friendship poems, inspirational quotes, and even a poetry contest for kids, and also kids' poems that are positive, romantic, and easy to understand for elder and for teen ages. In addition to the work of famous poets, you will also find a number of poems unique. If you are internet savvy, then you don't have to go anywhere, as you can get a good and impressive collection of poems through Poems site web, where new poems always get added every month and on the topic which you are looking for. Poems are used by everyone, but mostly used by the teenagers to express their love feeling. Then what you all are waiting for is just gotta love Poems site web, where you can put your feelings in words in front of your loved ones. Poems always work out in every situation, and it's very easy to get good collections of poems, and if you are familiar with the internet, then it's more convenient for you to get the selective poems on every situation without wasting your time and keeping your loved one and friends waiting for your reply. Being true to your art. My art is poetry, so I'm going to use this as my example, but feel free to apply this article to any art you have a true passion for, because I feel it's universal. I see so many people who enjoy writing being what I call crossover artists, who write in many genres but have no real specialty. I see romance authors or science fiction authors also putting out poetry books claiming to be authors, poets, and this to me is troubling. I am a poet who loves poetry and concentrates only on poetry, so this kind of thing, when it comes to crossing over, I personally find insulting. The people who do this crossing over from genre to genre, in my opinion, are just trying to get their names seen in as many places as possible in the hope that in one it will stick and someone will see it. I feel they care little for whatever genre they are writing under, and they only care for the press that comes from it. In the music industry, you don't see rappers, country artists, so why in the literary world do we see romance, science fiction poets? In my opinion, the crossovers have no real passion or belief in any one genre, so they write in them all, and to me it's disturbing. In my belief, they also lessen and take away from the accomplishments of true artists solely dedicated to one genre and one genre alone. You never see a proctologist, brain surgeon, and so you shouldn't have the fake author, poets of the world that lessen what poets do in the art. I study karate, and I took the time to find a real street effective self-defense system of genuine value that is not used for sport or pretty acrobatic shows. I have a passion for the art, and I'm true to it, not wanting to mix it up with other things like a bad salad. It's already perfect in every way to me without myself or someone else mixing things in and changing. It's the real and effective and valuable origin. I guess my message to crossovers would be to stop diluting the art we care for by just dabbling in it and then calling yourself a poet, because you disgrace real poets by doing that. Take a look at what happened to MC Hammer when he went and crossed over from dancing to a thug, and you'll understand the phony light real poets see you in. Think about having passion and originality for once, and be true to your art with an emphasis on the part that says your art. Leave ours alone and stop diluting it with your novice work and overblown ego. Be true to your art, people. Once you cross and change an art, it ceases to be what it was, and it begins to change because of dabblers and crossovers looking for another place to post their names, and it sickens me. If you know your true and real interest is not poetry, then leave it to the people who have it as a real and true interest, and stick to writing romance or whatever you do, because you're not and never will be a poet. Writing memorable poetry verses. There are many occasions in life that spur people into writing memorable poetry verses. Some of these verses might come when we fall in love for the first time, or they may come when we are exposed to a memorable experience that touches our heart in one way or another. Writing memorable poetry verses will only require a conscious effort since there is no true form to use to express the writing of poetry. Some of our earliest recollections about writing memorable poetry verses might come from grade school. The time-tested exposure to red roses and violets will lead us to create several sentences that tell some other people why we love them so much. Perhaps they already know that sugar is sweet, but they may not have any clue that someone loves them, and to hear that verse is a memorable experience. Other people begin writing memorable poetry verses after they have buried their best friend. The older tombstones at the cemetery might have verses of poetry on them that convey the true spirit of a person that might have lived 100 years ago. Some people are so enchanted by the verses that they read on some of the tombstones that they begin writing memorable poetry verses that can be used on greeting cards. Many poets will begin writing memorable poetry verses to convey a message. These messages might be long and drawn out, and by the time the verses are completed the words have developed into a play. Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet in acts that turned the verses of poetry into real-life conjectures that conveyed how seriously people take falling in love. When writing memorable poetry verses, poets should consider the power of the written words and realize that some people are willing to commit suicide from the emotion that comes from reading the words put to paper. People choose to compare their lives and their relationships with Romeo and Juliet and end up making the wrong choices in how to deal with their disparity. The poet is not at fault for how others perceive the end product if he spent writing memorable poetry verses that anyone could find solace or pleasure reading. Love is a powerful emotion that can enrich lives and firm commitments that may last a lifetime. Many marriage ceremonies include poetry that the bride and groom speak to each other. They are writing memorable poetry verses that convey words of commitment and fidelity but are more personable because they are spoken when they are standing in front of a congregation of family and friends. Poetry comes naturally, it's easier than you think. Just grab a piece of paper along with a working pen or a sharp pencil and begin writing your own genuine poem. While sitting on the couch or near the shore, regardless if you are alone or surrounded by strangers, poetry is one of those art forms you can explore anytime. If you are keen to visit poetry readings and you are known for your love of poetry books, perhaps it is time to explore your own ability to express your feelings and inner thoughts through an unconventional type of language use. Intellectual disputes over the definition of poetry and its distinction from other genres of literature were inextricably intertwined with the debate over the role of poetic form. As the 20th century coincided with the rejection of traditional forms and structures for poetry, people began questioning the purpose and meaning of traditional definitions for poetry and its unclear distinction from prose. Poetry, throughout the world today, often reflects the incorporation of poetic form and diction from other cultures as well as from the past and present practices, further complicating the numerous attempts of scholars to define and classify what once was confounded within the tradition of the Western canon. Poetry depends less on sentences and particular paragraphs than prose. The major structural elements of poetry generally are the line, the stanza or verse paragraph, and larger combinations of stanzas or lines such as cantos. In addition, the basic units of poetic form are often combined into larger structures, called poetic forms, such as the sonnet. From Homer's and William Shakespeare's poems to contemporary award-winning poets, language, rhythm, meter, and intonation have been studied extensively over the years in an effort to determine and classify poets, cultures, and social times. Furthermore, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, and consonance, as methods for creating repetitive patterns of sound, have each greatly been influenced by the particular language used and the era of a poem's creation. Since languages vary in the richness of their rhyming structures, in some languages, like Italian, for example, with its rich rhyming structure, it is possible to maintain a limited set of rhymes throughout a lengthy poem. In some cases, particularly lengthier formal poetry, such as some forms of epic poetry, stanzas are constructed according to strict rules and then combined to form a unity. In addition to the different structures and lengths of poems or poetic forms, the selection of particular words and meanings greatly influences a poem's ability to be interpreted by the reader. Aristotle wrote in the Poetics that, "The greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor." Whether your poem will include one or more types of metaphors, its poetic diction, the manner in which you will use language to convey the underlying meaning in combination to the sound and form, will be the first thing a reader will experience. Rhetorical devices, such as a metaphor, as well as tones of voice, such as irony, can add meaning to your poem and alter the connotation of the words used. It is known that allegorical stories are central to poetic diction for many cultures. But regardless of your poem's structural form, tone, rhythm, or language, attempting to write one can indeed increase your understanding of other people's poetic attempts and help you translate and understand different cultures, while increasing your language aesthetic palette. Poetry, an exercise in emotion and vulnerability. Henry David Thoreau is a keen and delicate observer of nature. A genuine observer, which, I suspect, is almost as rare a character as even an original poet, and nature, in return for his love, seems to adopt him as her especial child, and shows him secrets which few others are allowed to witness. Nathaniel Hawthorne, journal entry, September 1, 1842. Most of the greatest poets were not recognized for their work until they had long been laid to rest. Many suffered great difficulties in their personal lives, which may have led the poet to the wellspring from which they drew their words. It has been suggested that poetry was used in our long-distant past as a creative means of passing along traditions and history simply because the poetic language was easy to memorize and enjoyable to recite. The bards in medieval times were renowned for their use of poetry. From free verse to rhyme and meter, poetry remains a benchmark in the world of literature. The pursuit of poetic markets remains a positive way to further an ancient form of storytelling that requires a special gift while the poet's emotions are largely exposed. Poetry is the one element of writing that impacts the emotions of writers more than any other. The vulnerable feel of poetry allows a writer to explore circumstances and emotions in a way that is difficult to do in most writing genres. Most poets craft their words as a stress release and rarely share them with the world at large. However, there may be markets available for poetry. It is true that publishers of poetry are about as plentiful as wheat fields in the Arctic, but there are other avenues for your poetry that can allow you to publish your material in unique and memorable ways. Greeting card publishers are always interested in new succinct poems to share with card buyers. Poems can also be artfully placed on a line of gift merchandise including mugs and artwork suitable for framing. In our modern era, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who is able to make living writing poetry. However, poetry can provide a source of writing income and is often a creative outlet for those who also write in other genres. It is true there are those who have little appreciation for poetry, yet the poet's work has brought about significant societal debate and ultimate change in our world. Perhaps this is because the reader is invited to share the writer's perspective in an emotional way that allows a perspective to be heard with something other than ears. Poetry in a nutshell. Poetry is more than just rhyming and prose that is in meters and verse. It is an art form. It is something that cannot be judged by its cover and cannot be criticized to the point where it just sucks. Poetry is about expression. Poetry expresses the way we feel on a certain subject through imagery and other senses. It helps us deal with our daily problems, be it good or bad. The emotion which is put within the poem brings it life. A poem without emotion is not a poem at all but simply prose. Poetry is what makes us feel happy or sad, mad or gleeful, loving or broken-hearted. Poetry is life on paper. It does not need to be of a certain subject or even rhyme. Poetry is poetry. It has its own mind. If it flows well, if not, it needs work. The rules can be bent but not broken. Our life is our life and no one can tell us what we have been through but ourselves. We know best, not some stranger reading our poems. Our poetry is our life, not what someone says. Rhyming in poetry is not always the best way to express yourself. Rhyming actually takes away many words that could have been used. If you try to rhyme, it cuts your dictionary into little pieces. It doesn't need to be this way. Choose flow over rhyme. As a result of this, poetry is defined as a way of putting flowing words together in meter and verse to show emotion or tell a story. New types of poetry. There are many different types of poetry. I counted 50 on a quick search of the internet. You may have heard of haiku and limericks. There are more obscure types too, like terzanel and sestina. Learning different types of poetry though isn't nearly as much fun as inventing your own, so here are some ideas about that. Types of poetry. Playing with stanzas. What is a stanza? A division of a poem consisting of 2 or more lines. How many ways can you structure a stanza? As many as you want. Look at this stanza from the poem, Gratitude, so there is nothing to say, there is nothing to say, there is nothing, nothing. But gratitude, each line is a smaller part of the previous line. In this case, it quiets the mind in order to emphasize the last word, gratitude. However, this idea could be used in many ways. You could start with a line like, she watched the birds come in from the sea, and it can reduce to, come in from the sea, where Michael was left alone in the storm. Each stanza could have lengthening lines. Lines could be varied in length to create a picture on the page. Playing with stanzas is a fun way to create new types of poetry. Ideas for new types of poetry in the poem, Do Not Believe in God. Each stanza starts with one of our senses, see God, in stars and sunlight, and the face of your lover, hear God, in wind and waves, and the music of the birds. All the senses are covered. How could we use this general idea? By starting each stanza with a different verb or adjective. By starting each stanza with a different person's name. By having each stanza get smaller or larger as the poem progresses. How many ways can you play with poems? Dream poems could be a type of poetry that puts actual dreams into verse. Dialogue poems could have stanzas or lines answering each other back and forth. A series of poems could use all the exact same words, rearranged, with an entirely different outcome in each. There are endless types of poetry you can create. Are you talking to me? In poetic literature, you will often find a poem that seems to be inviting the reader to participate in an adventure or a love story. The use of you is evident in the poetry, but in most cases, the reader understands that the poem is written to a third party and the author is simply allowing you the opportunity to read these moments of intimate conversation. Possessives in poetry, marked by an apostrophe, are a way to understand that the poem is written for and to another person even when written from a first-person perspective. There is, however, a unique form of writing called authorial intrusion that will find the author breaking away from the storyline and speaking directly to the reader. This technique is sometimes used to take a work of fiction and make it seem somehow real. This is accomplished when the storyteller breaks from the action to talk directly with you. Authorial intrusion can also be used in poetry and is used extensively in persuasive essays. In fact, in essays, authorial intrusion is often used as a means of allowing a personal voice of persuasion to assist in the point being argued. You can see the use of authorial intrusions in old detective movies where they step out of the shadows and talk to the audience about what they are thinking. This particular adaptation has been used for comic effect in recent years as it has been used extensively in film parodies. As film and fiction writing has matured, the use of authorial intrusion has diminished. Sometimes authorial intrusions make work seem amateurish simply because the audience is informed of an impending scenario just before the scenario plays out. It can come across as redundant and unnecessary. Here's a short example of authorial intrusion. Ben had assumed there was nothing to fear on the plateau, but he didn't see the grizzly bear approaching from behind. This particular example really isn't needed in the context of the story. If the story is indeed Ben's, then allows the reader to experience the emotions Ben has when he makes the surprising discovery. In the case of fiction writing, authorial intrusions should be minimal in a worst-case scenario and eliminated altogether in a perfect world. When you choose a point of view in which to tell the story, it is best to allow that voice to remain as consistent as possible throughout the narrative. Romantic feelings. Romance, the eternal subject for most of the poets. Romance, the life-giving force. The romance that changes perceptions, and romance makes a dull night a night of poetic thoughts. Romance turns an ordinary flower into a lover's gift to be preserved forever. Romance produces letters that are saved for generations. Romance makes everything look happy and cheerful. Romantic feelings change perception. One who had never thought of reading a poem begins writing one. That is romance. One who is in romantic love will have no complaints about the world. Even if the traffic does not move for hours, the romantic lover excuses everyone. That is romance. Romance changes the way we look at the world. We see only good, and every bad thing becomes either good or tolerable for us. Romance makes us magnanimous in thoughts. Romantic feelings make us sit alone and live in our own dreams. We need no one except ourselves to enjoy the thoughts of our romance. We want to be left alone and feel total peace and joy. During romance, every lip smiles, and every eye shines with the light of love. Romance brings a new God in our life. Our beloved. Some romantics are ready to kiss the place where her sweetheart stepped. Romance is to be experienced and not talked about. Romance brings more hormonal changes in the body than any medicine and has a definite effect on the heartbeats. They increase at the thought of the beloved. That is romance, and to be in a romance is to experience the joy of heaven. There are many emotions and most of us experience all of them except romance. Emotions such as anger, nervousness, sadness, and others like these are experienced by all of us. But few experience romance. There is a popular story in India of two romantic lovers, Layla and Majnun. Layla was the princess and Majnun was the son of a washerman. Once, it so happened that Majnun's father asked him to deliver clothes to the palace. There Majnun happened to see Layla and he fell madly in love with her. Since that day, he forgot everything including food and was only asking for Layla. Some days passed, and this news that Majnun had gone mad in love with Layla and reached the king. The king asked his prime minister about what could be done to help Majnun in this distress. The prime minister suggested that if Majnun wanted to buy anything from any shop, he could buy it for free. The palace would pay the shopkeeper. This news brought in many new magnates. They bought things and behaved like the original. The palace started getting bills in plenty. The king was more worried now and again consulted his prime minister. The suggestion was simple: declare that Majnun will be killed after 7 days by the palace. This announcement made all the actors run away for their life. Only the original Majnun was left out. He had no care for his life. This made the king think again and he got Majnun married to Layla. Majnun got Layla because he wanted nothing except her. His own life was worthless for him. What mattered was only Layla. This is romance.